In the spring of 2023, Chinese regulators told the country's largest infrastructure buyers, the state telecoms, the cloud platforms, the data center operators, that Micron memory chips had failed a cybersecurity review and should be replaced. The directive was framed as a security measure. The practical effect was that billions of dollars of annual procurement suddenly needed somewhere else to go. And the only domestic option positioned to receive it was a fab in Hefei, Anhui called Changxin Memory Technologies, which barely registered in global market share tables at the time. How did a restriction designed to stop China's memory industry become the reason it now exists? A restriction is a lock, and a lock tells you what someone valued enough to seal. Read the Micron ban, not forward as a security measure, but backward as a blueprint, and it marks out exactly the market it intended to close off, which turned out to be the same market it handed to whoever could fill it. So how did a restriction designed to stop China's memory industry become the reason it now exists? The first answer is the obvious one. When Micron was effectively locked out of China's largest institutional buyers, those buyers needed dynamic random access memory from somewhere. Changxin Memory Technologies was the only domestic option at anything approaching volume. Demand that had been satisfied by imports had nowhere else to go domestically, so it went to Hefei. China's Cyberspace Administration ruled that Micron products posed relatively serious network security risks, a finding the company's own public disclosures confirmed. State telecoms and cloud operators were directed away from Micron by the procurement guidance that followed. Changxin Memory Technologies reported shipment volumes increased in the period after the ruling, by the company's own account, not independently benchmarked. That is not wrong as an answer. It is just shallow. My first instinct was that this was a simple substitution story. Remove one supplier, another steps up. Substitution explains the direction. It does not explain the speed, or why Changxin Memory Technologies specifically, or why now rather than 5 years ago when the pressure was already building. Demand shocks do not reliably produce new industries. Plenty of them produce shortages instead. Something else made this one productive. So, how did a restriction designed to stop China's memory industry become the reason it now exists? The sharper answer is that the ban restructured the investment calculus for a class of capital that had been sitting on the sideline. Building a leading-edge dynamic random access memory fab requires years of capital expenditure before a single chip ships at margin. In an open market, that investment competes against Samsung and SK Hynix on cost and yield simultaneously, before the customers are confirmed and before the process is proven. The ban changed that equation. Chinese state procurement became a committed anchor customer before the yield was proven, and state-linked funds absorbed the downside risk that would have deterred private capital entirely. China's National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, publicly known as the Big Fund, has made documented investments across domestic semiconductor infrastructure across multiple rounds, with Changxin Memory Technologies among reported beneficiaries. Analyst estimates from firms including Tech Insights and SemiAnalysis have noted that Chinese domestic fab economics depend heavily on captive demand to reach the utilization rates that justify operating costs. This is analyst inference, not independently verified yield data. The specifics of Changxin Memory Technologies' contract structure with state buyers are not publicly available, but the structure itself, guaranteed volume before proven performance, is a documented feature of how China has approached strategic industrial development. Think of it this way. A single leading-edge dynamic random access memory fab costs, by most industry estimates, somewhere between $15 and $20 billion to build and equip. Stack that in $100 bills, and you are looking at a column roughly the height of a 40-story building. That is the ante. The question the ban changed was not whether China could pay it. It was whether the table was worth sitting at. But this still treats the ban as trigger and the investment as response. Changxin Memory Technologies was founded in 2016. The big fund was active before Washington acted. So the financing story explains how capital flowed. It does not yet explain what the ban changed about competitive dynamics inside China that made that capital finally sufficient. So how did a restriction designed to stop China's memory industry become the reason it now exists? Here is the hypothesis I keep returning to. The decisive thing the ban did was not add money or add engineers. It removed a price. Micron's presence in China was a ceiling on what any domestic chip could charge and survive on. Once that ceiling lifted inside a protected perimeter, the economics of running a leading-edge fab, which are brutal in an open market, became for the first time survivable. Micron, Samsung, and SK Hynix have historically competed aggressively on price in China because China was their largest volume market. A domestic competitor trying to ramp yield against that pricing pressure is not competing on technology alone. It is competing against firms willing to run at thin margin to hold share. The ban did not just remove Micron from certain procurement lists. It removed the incumbent's ability to reprice against Changxin Memory Technologies inside the segment that mattered most. Changxin Memory Technologies did not have to beat Micron. It only had to be available. That is a fundamentally different competitive target. Imagine learning to ride a bicycle on a road where cars are not allowed. You will fall. You will be slow. You will wobble badly. But you will still be standing when the road opens. Because the traffic that would have ended the lesson before you learned balance was simply not there. Changxin Memory Technologies learned on a closed road. The ban closed it. A lock on a door keeps people out, yes, but it also keeps what is inside in. When the Micron ban sealed foreign chips out of China's institutional market, it sealed Chinese procurement, billions of dollars of it, inside a perimeter that Changxin Memory Technologies was the only entity positioned to reach. The lock was on the door. Changxin Memory Technologies was already in the room. Dynamic random access memory is a commodity market where pricing power is determined by utilization rates and supply discipline. This is established industry structure, not a claim specific to China. Reports from analysts at firms including Bernstein and Bloomberg Intelligence have noted that Micron's China revenue exposure was significant enough that losing institutional access represented material revenue risk. These are analyst estimates. No independent benchmark has yet confirmed that Changxin Memory Technologies' double data rate 4 products match Micron's current generation output on latency, power, or yield at scale. The competitive gap on leading-edge nodes remains, by most analyst accounts, real. I want to be careful here because the story I have been building risks over-claiming. Changxin Memory Technologies was founded in 2016. State investment was flowing before any action from Washington. The groundwork was laid in a world where the ban did not exist yet. So the honest version is, the ban did not create Changxin Memory Technologies. What it did was change the probability that Changxin Memory Technologies would survive long enough to matter. The bullish reading is real. If Changxin Memory Technologies continues scaling double data rate 4 into domestic cloud and telecoms infrastructure, it does not need to beat Samsung on the global spot market to matter geopolitically. Capturing the captive Chinese market at competitive yield would make it the 3rd or 4th largest dynamic random access memory producer by volume. That is a structural change in the industry, not a footnote. The bearish reading is also real. Changxin Memory Technologies has not publicly demonstrated leading-edge double data rate 5 yield at volume. The node gap between its reported production and where Samsung and SK Hynix operate is real and not trivial to close. Heat management, defect density, and equipment constraints around lithography are physical limits that state capital does not dissolve. Reports suggest Changxin Memory Technologies remains dependent on legacy nodes for its volume products. The honest position is that the ban did not build Changxin Memory Technologies. It changed the survival odds for a company that was already being built by removing the most dangerous weapon the incumbents had in the one market Changxin Memory Technologies needed to prove itself in first. Which brings us back to the driving question, and why it is slightly the wrong one. Asking how the restriction became the reason China's memory industry now exists assumes the restriction's architects failed at their stated goal. But if you read the policy backward through the lock, a different question forms, one that is less about what this ban stopped and more about what the next ban will inadvertently build. Which segment of China's semiconductor industry is the next export control most likely to protect into existence? Wherever the next restriction lands, look immediately at who is already inside the perimeter, what captive demand they can reach, and whether the pricing pressure from the incumbent has just been removed. That is where the next Changxin Memory Technologies is sitting. Probably already funded, probably already behind on nodes, and now suddenly no longer competing on the same terms. I think the Changxin Memory Technologies story is less about Chinese industrial policy succeeding and more about export controls being a blunter instrument than their designers tend to believe, one that shapes the market it is aimed at in ways that run perpendicular to the intent. Changxin Memory Technologies is still behind. Its yield data is not independently verified. The node gap is real, but it is shipping. And it is shipping into a market where Micron is no longer allowed to undercut it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole story. The lock was supposed to keep China out of the memory market. Read it backward. It also sealed the market in. The ban worked, just not in the direction anyone announced. If you were drawing the map of the next restriction, high bandwidth memory, advanced packaging, extreme ultraviolet adjacents, which domestic Chinese company do you think is already sitting inside the room the lock is about to close? Drop your answer below. And if this kind of backward read on tech policy is useful to you, subscribe. This is what we do here every week.